Hello folks, welcome to this video on Cornell Notes. Now before we dive into Cornell Notes and what they are, I want to talk about some background behind them. To do that, we're going to talk about the curve of forgetfulness. Now we all know that over time, information that we have learned is forgotten. We've all experienced this. But the forgetting curve hypothesizes the decline of memory retention in time. This curve shows how information is lost over time when there is no attempt to retain it. The forgetting curve looks something like this. Here you can see that the amount of information retained dramatically decreases in time. It shows that even after one day, you lose 50% of the information gained. And after 4 days, you're less than 20%. So our question then becomes, what can we do to combat this forgetting curve? Well, the answer to that, my friends, is by reviewing. When material is reviewed, the curve of forgetfulness is affected, and the chances of remembering the material long-term is improved. As you can see in this graph, not only does it spike every time you review, but the total amount of memory retained improves with each review. So, if we can review our material more, the more we remember. Let's now look at where Cornell Notes came from. Cornell Notes was developed by Walter Pock, who was a professor at Cornell University. He specifically was frustrated with how quickly his students forgot the material taught during his lectures. So, he did some research and learned about the forgetting curve and how reviewing affects the forgetting curve. After performing his research, Pock then developed a note-taking method which was designed to combat the forgetting curve via reviews, and thereby Cornell Notes were born. So how do you take Cornell Notes? Well, first you have to set up your page. You can't just use a blank piece of paper. So the first thing you do is write your name, date, class, and period in the upper right-hand corner of your paper. Then write the topic of the notes on the top line. So for example, you could use World War II, cells, nouns, or for this class, you would use motion for your first Cornell Notes. Then you'll draw a horizontal line about 5 lines up from the bottom. After that, draw a vertical line down the page 1/3 of the distance from the left. You're now ready to start taking notes. Now when using Cornell Notes, the only real section that you use for taking notes is the top right section. This is your main notes section. And in this section, while you're doing your reading or listening to your lecture or watching your video or whatever you're using for Cornell Notes, you'll go ahead and write down your keywords and definitions, your important concepts, any descriptions you need, draw any diagrams or pictures you're putting in there, write down your equations, define your variables, any sample problems as well. Whatever you use your notes for, you do in this main section. But remember, the main parts of Cornell Notes is that during this, when you're taking notes, you only write in this section. Now after you're done with your notes is when you need to start reviewing and the power of Cornell Notes come into play. So after you're done with your main section notes, you fill in the left column, which we refer to as the Q section. And here you review over your main notes, and then I'd pull out what the main ideas are and write down any questions that you have about the material. Again, let me emphasize that this is done as a review after you do your main notes taking, in order to take advantage of the reviewing power and combat the curve of forgetfulness. But it doesn't end here. The bottom section you'll fill in as a summary, but you do this as a review 24 hours after you take your notes. So 24 hours after you have the class or do the reading or whatever the case is, you come back and write a summary of the notes that you took before. Again, we do this in order to combat the curve of forgetfulness, so we can remember the material in our notes for the long term. Now, I've heard people say that Cornell Notes is just an effective way to organize your notes, and that's not necessarily true. If you're using it just to organize your notes in a special way, you're not taking advantage of the reviewing power that Cornell Notes have. So, in order to make sure that you take advantage of the full power of Cornell Notes, make sure that you fill in the Q section immediately after you've finished your class or your reading, and fill in the summary section 24 hours after the class or the reading. In conclusion, I just want to go over some helpful note-taking tips. Now, when you're taking notes, you can use abbreviations and paraphrases to shorten your notes and take more notes in a shorter amount of time. Another thing you can do is use symbols like circles, arrows, or underlining, or even highlighting to emphasize your important ideas and relationships that are present. Another idea to help you out is to skip lines between ideas and sections. And last but not least, goes back to our curve of forgetfulness, is to review the notes often so you can combat that forgetting curve. Hopefully this helps you not only in this class, but in your other classes in the notes that you have to take.